Andy McCarthy, who's here with me, Judge Janine as well, and Trey Gabby. Andy, where we go from here, obviously there will automatically be an appeal from this Trump team as quickly as possible. There's the legal issue of sentencing to come. That's going to take maybe months to get to a pre-trial report on this and then to a sentencing by the judge, and he reminded the jurors he's the one who decides. But we have the reality now of the former president for the first time being convicted on 34 criminal counts, guilty on all of these counts. Whatever conflict or confusion or questions the jury had, they got that information back to them this morning, and by the end of day 2 of deliberations, we're at 34 guilty counts for the former president of the United States of America.
It's a historic trial of a former president of the United States by his partisan adversaries. Whatever you think of the results, it's inconceivable in New York that anyone else other than Donald Trump would ever been indicted in this way by Alvin Bragg, the elected progressive Democratic district attorney who campaigned on the fact that he would go after Donald Trump, that he had a history of going after Donald Trump. This is a very political exercise, and you have to say that it accomplished what it set out to accomplish. What they wanted was to have a situation where they could call Donald Trump a convicted felon in the run-up to the election. We have an elected Democrat who got that accomplished. He got a very friendly judge who ruled his way on every important thing and turned the jury instructions into a roadmap to conviction. So now I assume, with the mission having been accomplished, we'll have more procedural regularity, Shannon. As you just said, there'll be a pre-sentence investigation, there should be a sentencing schedule, and we'll go from there. But this case will be appealed, and I hope that there'll be more fairness and equity in the appeal than there was in the trial.
And Trey, when these counts, this indictment first came in, there were a lot of people across the political and legal spectrum who said this feels like the weakest case against President Trump. Something changed along the way. How much of this had to do with the guidance from Judge Merchan, whether it was the jury instructions, whether it was the decisions on objections, whether it was the decision not to let in certain witnesses that the defense wanted to call?
All of the above. The verdict is a necessary and probable consequence of everything that happens up to that point. So that includes jury selection, it includes evidentiary rulings. I was in the courtroom or the overflow room 4 different days. Shannon, it wasn't just the result of Judge Merchan's rulings. The tone of his voice was different depending on which side was doing the objecting. So, look, I said a week ago, juries usually get it right based on the information they're given. When you don't get to hear from an FEC expert, when you hear both proximity and propensity evidence against the defendant, and by that I mean he was close to 2 people who were guilty, therefore he must be guilty, and you hear salacious details with Stormy Daniels. I mean, I didn't ever think it was going to be an acquittal. Having been in the courtroom, I thought it might be a hung jury, 10-2, 11-1. But verdict is only the result of what you're given up until that point. So this is not a surprising result to me.
Okay, so Judge, I want to bring you in here. Obviously, an appeal takes time. It could be months, it could be years. Like Andy said, it may be a long time before that is resolved, however it is resolved. But what that leaves is this White House, the Biden-Harris campaign, free now to call President Trump a convicted felon. I gotta say though, over a year ago when President Trump was asked, will you drop out of this race if convicted, or not convicted, if indicted, he said, no, because I actually think it will help me in my poll numbers. They've done well in fundraising, he's done well in polling. Does this help or hurt now in the public opinion where he's gotta get independent voters, where he's gotta get people who are not necessarily part of his base, now that he's got this conviction, which may or may not one day be overturned?
Shannon, I don't have the answer to that question. I want to believe that Americans believe in justice, and I think that in their gut, they realize that there is something that is very wrong here. We have gone over a cliff in America. This verdict is a verdict of someone who was forced to fight a 1,000-pound gorilla with both hands tied behind his back. This was a defendant for whom crimes were created, against whom a judge was picked out of the ordinary, not from the drum, but a judge who was handpicked for this defendant who denied him the ability to fight the way he needed to fight, who brought in crimes that we've never heard of in New York before, where they had dead misdemeanors that they resurrected into felonies based upon non-unanimous verdicts of crimes that are federal, over which no state court or no state judge or prosecutor has jurisdiction. And in the end, with all the smoke and mirrors and 34 counts and a hooker and a guy, according to a federal judge, is a serial perjurer, we have convicted a former president of the United States of America. We've gone over a cliff. The question as to whether or not America will react to this, whether its numbers will go up or down, I don't know. But I do know what I know. And what I know is that this case is riddled with errors. It is reversible. It will not get through to the appellate division and the first department in New York, or certainly the Court of Appeals before the next year. And people say, should it go to the Supreme Court? No, it can't go to the Supreme Court unless they exhaust all of the state court appeals. I've spent 32 years in this system, and I am totally disillusioned. You had a judge and you had a DA who literally campaigned on making sure that this president would be indicted. We've got an attorney general who did the same thing. This is a new era in America, and I think it goes against the ilk of who we are as Americans and our faith in the criminal justice system.
So, if you're just joining us, 34 counts, 34 in that indictment against President Trump. Today, the jury comes back unanimously convicting him guilty on all 34 counts. They were all similar in that they had to do with falsification of business records. That was what would have been a misdemeanor. That's where the statute of limitations would have run. And there was another underlying crime, which we didn't find out about what that was going to be essentially until the closing argument and the jury instructions from the judge yesterday. He gave them choices. Trey, we've talked about this many times, that they had choices. Will we ever know what choice the jury made with linking this to an underlying crime?
There are only two ways you'll know that, maybe possibly three. On appeal, arguably, the government can be forced to explain what that second crime was. Maybe it's in the special verdict form and we haven't seen it. It certainly wasn't read to the jury. It wasn't polled. The jury was just polled, which means each individual juror was asked, is this your verdict and still your verdict? We don't know what that secondary crime was. Or a member of the jury could talk. They're not required to. They'll be told that they don't have to, but sometimes members of the jury will talk and they'll say this was that extra crime that we found.
What do you think, Andy? The judge there talks about how people are going to react to this in different ways. We've got a tweet out now from Donald Trump Jr. He says, guilty on all counts, the Democrats have succeeded in their years-long attempt to turn America into a third world blank. November 5th is our last chance to save it. So, tough news for the former president legally, but politically, does he get a boost from this on the campaign trail saying, okay, they did what I told you they were going to try to do to me. Now you have to elect me in order to head all of the rest of this off that I predict will come.
Hard for us to gauge as people who were very involved in politics, because I think at this point in the campaign, the people you're trying to reach are the people who aren't all that taken in with politics. For most of the people who are in our world and who follow this closely, I think they're pretty stuck in their positions. And what I've always wondered, and I'm not the political guy, we got a former member of Congress with us here, but I thought that the internal polling of the Democrats has to tell them, it would seem to me, that being able to call Trump a convicted felon in the run-up to the election is worth X number of points in the battleground states. So even if it fires up his base, and it should, and even if Janine, I think, is quite right, that this is going to change American prosecution and the American justice system for the worse, because the flag of politicized prosecution has been planted here in a way that it's never been planted before. But as it plays politically, I think the question is, how much is it worth to have that talking point for them in the run-up to the election?
Yeah, and Judge Janine, we think about that in also the context of the fact that if they're, as we've talked about, going to now start referring to former President Trump as convicted felon Donald Trump, and whether they're going to use that language, that we also know Hunter Biden is facing 2 federal trials, which we can talk about as well. One of them starting on Monday, and the fact that I don't think the Trump campaign is going to pull any punches if Hunter Biden winds up convicted of something. It does look to many people across the spectrum here in America that a lot of our political fighting has turned to legal warfare as well.
Interesting, Shannon. We've been calling it
Judge.
lawfare. I think lawfare is far too soft. It's far too benign. This is warfare. This is the taking down of someone, not just politically, but legally, and looking to take away their civil liberties. And you know, as a prosecutor and a judge, my job was to make sure that the guilty were convicted and to make sure that their people's civil liberties weren't taken away. I understand the president's coming out.
Okay. Yeah, Judge, if you'll hold on just a second. We see President Trump now. He is walking out. Let's listen.
Trial by a convicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a menu change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. We have a Soros-backed DA and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to move to hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end and we'll win. Because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now. From prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists. And they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble. But this was a rigged decision right from day one with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
Are you getting thought out? You know the rule of law. We trust the jury. Are you
All right, the former president speaking there briefly, not taking any questions. It's been his practice as he's been speaking here at the courthouse. And remember, he's been under a gag order for this trial as well, which has been, it's been stretched, I think, to its limits at sometimes. There have been findings by the judge that there have been violations, but the former president has spoken openly from the beginning, saying that he felt this judge had conflicts. There have been references to his daughter, the work that she does, to Alvin Bragg, and to the way that this whole thing was set in motion. Trey, you look like you had some reaction to what he was saying there, because of course this then flipped into campaign mode, because the line will be, okay, the people get to answer, their verdict is the one that matters November 5th. It's going to be a push to that now is the talking point with this over.
My guess is at some point President Trump or his surrogates will say, perhaps I am a convicted felon, you are unconvicted felons. You have engaged in egregious conduct. It just hasn't resulted in us using the court system to go after you. I think the Biden campaign needs to be really, really careful. His son may be a convicted felon by this time next week. The other thought I had going through my mind is I was in an audience sitting by Tim Scott in South Carolina when Donald Trump went to great lengths to defend New York. Remember, candidate Ted Cruz made an unflattering reference to New York values. Andy, you may recall that. And Donald Trump went to great lengths as a candidate to defend New York. And I just think it is bitterly ironic that it wound up being a district attorney from New York who actually openly campaigned on doing what he just did. That is a disservice to the justice system. Prosecutors shouldn't care about the politics. You don't go after people, you go after crime. This new era of so-called progressive prosecutors, there's nothing progressive about them. They are defense attorneys masquerading as prosecutors, and it's going to wind up ultimately, I think it may be the undoing of our country.
Well, I hope that is not the case. That feels very ominous, but I know that people worry if they feel like they can't have confidence in their judicial system. We know that when it comes to Congress, when it comes to many of our institutions in Washington, polling shows us, whether it's Pew or Gallup, there have been a lot of them in recent months and years that have showed people they're worried about the underpinnings of our country, and they want to be able to trust them that no matter what their position, their politics are, that they're going to be treated fairly once they get into the court system. Now, John Yoo has a piece, I talked to him earlier in the 3 o'clock hour, he's a piece out today saying that this is already, no matter what the verdict was going to be, it's already damaged the presidency, and that folks on both sides of the aisle now have to consider that this is the way business gets done. There are some who would say, don't encourage Republicans to now go try to use the court system in the same way. But it seemed to me in an overview of John's piece that he seemed to suggest, well, if this is the way the game has played now, both sides are going to start playing it. And as Trey suggests, maybe it's a new chapter in our country, the way we do things.
Yeah, I think it's a new chapter. I feel it personally. Like, as this trial unfolded and we got more of a read on what Bragg's theory was that the judge was going to allow him to let fly, I started to think about this in terms of what's going on out there that this could be used as a precedent to attack. So, for example, this very vague, vaporous idea that somehow politics, what we've always done is politics as usual, which is filled with hyperbole and often just flat out untrue statements, right? Now that's being brought into the prosecutorial realm, into the courtroom. So it occurred to me, for example, if I wanted to have a model like a very loose conspiracy against the United States, which occasionally gets invoked in federal court, where it's a deceptive scheme to prevent the government from carrying out an essential function, like having an honest election. Well, what if I decided that Joe Biden knows that when he says that it was 9% inflation when he took office, he knows that's not true, and yet he says it again and again and again. Why isn't that a deception against the electorate? And if he got together with his campaign advisors and said, this would be a good talking point, why couldn't some aggressive prosecutor say, that looks to me like a fraud kind of case that Alvin Bragg brought in New York? And that's the way that people are going to think in this system. I think it's a terrible development. Bill Barr was correct when he said, no, the president's not above the law, but if you're going to bring a case against the president, it should be a strong crime that everybody recognizes as a crime and that you have convincing evidence for. It can't be one of these flimsy things where it looks capricious, where there's a lot of political judgment in whether to bring it, and where you need the judge to put his thumb on the scale to get it home.
All right, so Judge, I want to bring you in here because we heard from the president. He came out, he mentioned the fact that this is a venue where he got very little of the vote last time around, the last presidential election. It's no secret that Manhattan is, I think the estimates were about 85% plus or more in voting for President Biden last time around. He talked about the fact that they're not going to lose this. Ultimately, he says, we're going to keep fighting. We know that an appeal will happen. He says we ultimately will win. And we'll have to see. Listen, if he's still fighting that fight as president or as a candidate who failed to re-win the White House after November, that is yet to be seen. But in the meantime, what price does he pay politically, or does he not pay politically, as that appeals process, plays out, and he now calls to the American people to deliver their own verdicts in November?
Well, I think that the American people will be struck by this, as we are all struck by it, in different ways. I, as a former prosecutor and a judge who knows the state courts and who knows the state law, I know that this is riddled with reversible error. I know that there was no basis to charge this crime, this alleged crime, and to resurrect dead misdemeanors based upon non-unanimous federal violations of the election law or of the tax law. So, you've got that, but there's also a gut punch to the criminal justice system in the United States. People realize we are no longer safe anymore, and it's because of the progressive left agenda of making sure that we don't keep people in jail. And they're out there with 33 arrests, but they're still assaulting people or violently attacking people down the street here. But now we've got one of the most famous individuals in the world, the former president of the United States, who can be taken down by a George Soros-funded prosecutor on a crime that doesn't exist, where not one person put his finger anywhere near that bookkeeping, and now they're going to return a verdict and say, oh, he's guilty, he's definitely guilty. This is a jury pool made out of 85 to 90% of the people are anti-Trump, not pro-anybody, anti-Trump. That's the jury pool. We knew it. We have a judge who wasn't picked out of the wheel or out of the drum, as all of us judges are, and he was a judge who was selected, not just for the Trump organization, not just for the this case, but also for the another case that involves who's the guy who was the Bannon case as well. This is an anti-Trump judge, an anti-Trump prosecutor. America's going to respond to this. This is a gut punch. We want to see politicians fight. We don't want to see what they do in third world countries, to have one side start indicting and jailing the other side. This is not American. This is not who we are. And to see this happen before our eyes, when we know that this is not legitimate, when a defendant was not advised of the crimes that he was charged with, they don't even know what the crimes are until we get to the charge to the jury, as if the prosecution and the judge, with a wink and a nod, said, hey, I'll give you that old accomplice testimony, even though we didn't charge Donald Trump with aiding and abetting anyone else. I'll throw it in as a matter of law. He's an accomplice. And I'll throw in those federal election violations, so they'll have to say, yeah, Donald Trump must have done it too. And I'll throw in a hooker and a guy who's a serial perjurer. This is lunacy. And I think that any red-blooded American who sees this is going to understand this isn't what we do to our political enemies. This is what they do in kangaroo courts and third world countries. God help America after what I've seen in the last few weeks.
All right, Judge, I want to bring in Professor Jonathan Turley, who has been in the courtroom today. So you're fresh out of there. Can you give us any of the flavor? Because when we thought that the court was going to break for the day, it seems like President Trump and his team seemed relaxed, that he was smiling. Maybe they thought, okay, this jury is still struggling. They're going to leave tonight not having made a decision. Then we get word that verdict is coming in. What can you tell us about the mood inside the courthouse?
It was one of the most bizarre moments I've had in a courtroom, and I was just observing. The judge had just said that the jury could not reach a decision and that we would be dismissed for the day. Some reporters actually gathered their stuff and was starting to leave. And then the judge came and basically said, my mistake, we just got a note saying there's a verdict. Throughout this time, you could feel the building pressure in that courtroom. The one person that didn't seem to register it was the former president. He had been chatting with counsel. He didn't show any emotion at all as this mantra of guilty verdicts was read. And it was a great, I think that this is one of those things that is really embodies the entire Trump era. There were people who clearly were thrilled by the result, and there were people that will be very sad by it. I was saddened to watch it. I disagree with this verdict. I think, as I've said before, that this case was legally unfounded. When they were reading those guilty verdicts, the one thing that we didn't know is really what he was found guilty of. Because if you remember, the judge allowed the jury to find guilt on any one of 3 secondary crimes. We weren't told whether the jury found any one of those crimes, whether they found all 3 of those crimes. I'm not too sure we will know that. That's one of the many issues that I think presents reversible problems in this case. So what I would say is that this is a historic moment. We all have to take a breath. But for those upset by this verdict, remember this remains a country committed to the rule of law. And this is going to go up on appeal. I think it's going to be reversed in the state or federal systems. But it's moments like this when you're on the other side, when you disagree with a verdict, that you have to take a leap of faith in the rule of law. It's what defines us. Many people feel that this case really embodied the antithesis of that. But as a country as a whole, we have a system in place to review this. For Donald Trump, that's not going to happen before the election in all likelihood. But let's keep in mind that this is not the only court, it's just the first one.
Well, and there have also been jury trials and judges and decisions that have been made that have already been tough for the former president in other contexts too, in the business context and in another personal case involving Eugene Carroll. I mean, there are other decisions that have been made against him that have been very difficult. They've been in New York. What do you think that portends or does not with these other cases we have pending? Georgia, it doesn't look like it's going to get to trial before we get to November. You've got the two federal cases. We're waiting for the Supreme Court decision on immunity, which could come as early as next Thursday. We get opinions then again. What will that case mean to all of these things that are pending or have already been decided? When it comes to this question, we heard the arguments there at the Supreme Court. There were two extremes. Anything and everything the president does, you can't question any of it. There must be full immunity from any kind of criminal activity. Two, there's nothing. There's no protection from him. We know the justices are going to land, we think, somewhere in between, not go with those extremes. But how critical now is that decision as we wait for that?
Well, it's very critical, both in terms of law and the timing. The court did seem to reject the extremes on both sides. They didn't like the extremes of the Trump team in terms of the sweeping immunity, but they also didn't like the Court of Appeals approach. They felt that it gave too little recognition of the needs of the office. So they could end up sending this back for further evidence and for determinations by the trial court. It seems unlikely that the judge will be able to get that done before the election. Florida does not appear to be heading towards a trial before the election.
And that's the federal Mar-a-Lago document.
Yes, and someone like Andy and others who've dealt with classified trials, that is not strength. If anything, moving at a fairly good